Welcome to another episode of the Vision with Execution show. My name is Adam Torkelson. My guest today is John Carter, but I think your background in military service, which thank you, by the way. I love all military service members. I appreciate that service. But also your background in healthcare leadership. That combination is, I think, pretty unique. And so that's just those two things by themselves made it. So I was really excited, Bill, to have you on. And I want to get straight into some of the areas that we were talking about with new leadership style and integrating AI into healthcare systems and how modern healthcare systems need to be run so that you can actually have a great functioning team. I think perfect guy to talk about it. So I'm going to read your introduction so that everybody knows why you're supremely qualified here. But you have nearly 2 decades of healthcare experience and 14 years of military service as an Army Artillery and Strategy officer. You bring a disciplined yet adaptive leadership style rooted in mission clarity. And here's the critical part, I think. Your leadership philosophy is shaped from those complex adaptive environments, which empowers healthcare organizations to execute transformation with purpose and resilience. I'm going to read this next section. Your operational background includes leading network operations for one of North Texas's largest independent physician associations, where you oversaw payer contracting, physician engagement, performance improvement, and value-based care programs for 650 plus physicians across 250 plus practices.
I appreciate you having me on, and definitely teed it up with some big shoes to fill. I don't know if I'm supremely qualified to answer all of your questions, but certainly excited for the conversation, and will do my best to give you some insight on things I've learned from the military and how that's transitioned into healthcare. And I think both the military and healthcare have gone through some pretty significant transformational change over probably the last 10 to 15 years. And so it's been interesting to kind of see both of those play out. So excited for the conversation.
So I'm going to jump right in. You have led in both military and healthcare, obviously. So in your opinion, why is leadership in healthcare breaking down right now?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't say that it's breaking down. I would say probably more so that it's strained, right? And it's definitely not a talent issue. I think healthcare leaders are some of the best servant leaders I've ever come across, probably since I left the military, which is one of the reasons I was drawn to healthcare. It was a continuation of my service. I think the environment has changed. We talk a lot about kind of the older models of healthcare. We talk about silos. I think if the environment changes, the leadership model must adapt and change as well. And so when you look at healthcare today, you look at complex adaptive systems, right? You talk about workforce instability, you talk about financial pressures, you talk about margin compression, regulatory shifts, AI, obviously we're going to talk a little bit about as well. But my experience, at least in the traditional healthcare sense, is that a lot of those are operating with industrial era leadership models that are very centralized, very command and control, heavy, slow, that, kind of, we have people that do all of these different things, stay in your lane. And so while we've done a really good job with high reliability networks, and while we've done a really good job with, the quality of the Malcolm Baldrige, I think from a leadership development and implementation perspective, it is something that we really need to focus on, because when you look at those models, if we're operating in those models, but we're still trying to get some form of transformation, we're rewarding incremental optimization. And so I think we're just operating on the wrong side of the decimal. And I actually stole that from an article about a year or so ago. I read an article, I think it was called, Lessons from a Bag of Doritos or something like that. But what he was talking about is the difference between the left side of the decimal and the right side of the decimal. And on the right side of the decimal is that incremental change. It's that management section. And that's great if you really want to fine tune, but transformation is leadership and vision. And I think that happens on the left side of the decimal. And so we've got to, from how do we train and develop our leaders, we've got to take that model mismatch and we have to create more alignment, because again, when the environment changes, the leadership model has to change to develop those agile and adaptive leaders outside of these traditional silos.
Okay, so you mentioned several different words in that whole description, and one of the ones that stood out to me because I don't necessarily understand it well, you said complex adaptive system. So what does that actually mean for a hospital CEO day to day?
Yeah, well, more broadly than just hospitals, but certainly I think we'll focus more on kind of the traditional healthcare services for today. Outcomes are not linear, right? They're much more interconnected. And if I'm in a hospital, I think a staffing change that impacts throughput, I think it impacts patient experience, it impacts revenue. Payer shifts, they change behavior, right? Because we still have a very fee-for-service heavy chassis that we're tied to. Technology introduces friction. AI introduces friction. And so I think when we look at how everything is interconnected from a CEO, the shift has to go from controlling decisions to shaping systems. You're not going to have all the answers, but if you enable better decisions across the organization, you're going to get better results. So you don't really manage a complex system, you influence it. And so how do you build frameworks, and how do you empower people, and how do you move decisions downstream so that people can operate with autonomy and clarity? And I think that's where we're looking to really adapt and build these models.
Okay, so you sort of answered this already, but why does the command and control leadership style fail in modern healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, I think the model has changed. I think what you find, and just like the military, right? I mean, the military was, very command and control heavy, and as the battlefield adapted, so did our leadership development philosophy. And so we went to a much stronger decentralized command so that everybody knew how to execute. And so I think what you find is that latency in our current healthcare system, which requires speed. And so if I'm looking at it from a command and control perspective, if I'm looking at it from a top-down approach, I'm assuming that leaders have the best information. I'm assuming that the environment is predictable, and I'm assuming that decisions should be centralized. And really, none of that holds true anymore, not only in the military, but certainly in healthcare. What actually happens under those models is decisions get escalated unnecessarily. People are kind of afraid to act. Frontline expertise is often ignored in those type of operating environments, which leads to turnover because they want to learn and grow too. And then ultimately, initiatives get replaced with compliance. And so my experience is that too much control doesn't create order. It creates inertia, right? So either something's going to stay at rest or it's going to continue at its constant velocity until it's acted upon by an outside force. And that is not really the operating environment in today's healthcare, or really in today's business, that we need. Command and control is going to create compliance. It's not going to create performance. And what we're looking to do from a transformational perspective is to create better performance. Well, I would say in more simple terms, then, how about this? The closer the decision is to the problem, the better the decision is going to be.
Yeah. I loved your analogy, by the way. It's like, I love physics and trying to relate things to the natural world we already see around us, but the way you just brought it into a normal answer, that told me something about you and how you think. So that's awesome.
Well, you can thank the Army for that one too, because the artillery is very much physics and trigonometry. You got to take a big heavy projectile and you've got to put it way downrange. So there's a lot of math involved, and there's quite a bit of science to it,
which is awesome. And I think that's important for a lot of people to know. I'm thinking of the generation that is being raised with video games right now. And my son is a prime example. He's 20 years old. He and I had the chance to go do a simulation in an Apache simulator at the Army National Guard here in Utah. And he had an amazing time with it. It was very realistic. We were blowing up targets. It was super fun. It made me sick to my, like, nauseous after like 5 minutes in that thing, because it's so realistic. He handled it just fine. But those video game environments, and you can think back to books like Ender, where these young kids are learning how to do things like video games, and they're doing these crazy maneuvers. But then in the real world, does it actually translate? And I've often wondered that question, because for better or worse, the generation we're raising right now is raised on screens.
Yeah.
And AI is a big part of that, and for a variety of different reasons. And so this is nothing more than stuff that I personally think about. But I'm curious, from sort of a recruiting standpoint for military, does it seem to make much of a difference if these kids have first-person shooter video game experience or not?
I've been out of the military now for quite some time, so I'm probably not close enough to the vest to give you a definitive answer. I mean, I certainly think that helps. I think even from playing Call of Duty, which I wish I had time to play video games these days, but I think they have a pretty solid sense today of tactics and maneuvers that probably accelerate the learning curve. Certainly, what we've seen with drones, you've got people stateside that are flying missions overseas. I actually have a dear friend, and I won't mention him by name, but shout out Blue Wolf, that, flew Apaches for the Army. And so, I think I even remember a story, and I probably should pay more attention. I don't get to watch a lot of TV, but the F1 series on Netflix, I think, they've got the F1 simulators that are as real as they get. And I think there was a guy that trained on the simulator and did so well, they ended up putting him into F1, and now he drives for F1. And so, sure, I think it shortens the learning curve and it builds the advantage. But as I would tell people coming into any organization, whether it's the military, healthcare, or anything in life that you do, you need to be smart enough to be dumb enough to be teachable and coachable. And so while it may give you a heads up and while you may be coming in with a stronger base of knowledge than when I showed up and didn't know anything, you still got to drink the Kool-Aid to some degree. You got to learn, you got to develop, and you got to be malleable. You've got to be coachable. And I think that people that have that understanding and have that mentality will go a lot further. So I would agree with you, but it's definitely anecdotal. I don't have enough real world evidence to say if it does or doesn't speed up the learning curve. My bigger concern is how much time people are spending on screens and not interacting with other humans and not outside playing and training. And one of the things I notice is people coming into the military with conditions that are frankly reserved for elderly living with osteoporosis. We need better warfighters out there. And so, if you take away anything, it's people need more vitamin D and they need to be outdoors and they need to be spending more time with people in the real world.
Yeah. And there's a whole host of ways that you could apply that into healthcare as well, because patient care, it's hard to quantify how valuable it is to go outside 20 minutes a day and go for a walk. But more and more data is showing that there's a ton of health benefits to just doing that once a day, going for a 20-minute walk. No matter how old you are, it helps your brain, it helps your body. You're out in the sun, it helps your mood. It helps the whole person. And that can only be a positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're certainly drifting, but while we're on the topic, one of the things that I kind of live by, and I would say it's kind of a core tenet of my own personal belief, is that it is much easier to act your way into healthy thinking. So strong mind, strong body, strong soul, strong spirit. If you're feeling down or if you're feeling depressed or if you're struggling, get outside, go work out, go for a run, go do something. But that activity is what releases those endorphins and that dopamine, which drives those behaviors. And so, the action is what drives the mentality, not the other way around. So don't just sit around and think about it. Get outside and go do something, and you will feel better, and it will probably reset your frame of mind and help you get over whatever it is you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, no, there's so many ways that shows up in everyday life. But let's bring it back into healthcare for a second.
Sure.
We're talking about execution and building teams and decentralized command. When you're building teams, how do you give them the most autonomy without losing control?
Yeah, so we call it decentralized command in the military. I call it decentralized execution in the civilian world. And so, interestingly enough, I actually took my command philosophy from the military that's based on mission command, which is our doctrine, and repurposed it for the civilian world. And so what I call it is freedom in a framework. And I think we'll dive a little bit more into that as we get through some of these questions. But at its core, decentralized command or execution is just control through clarity, right? It's not through oversight. It is clear intent. So for me, it's as an organization, what is the vision? And then what's the end state? So that kind of we've arrived moment. How do we know once we've arrived? And then what happens is you create shared understanding and you get people clear intents, and then you allow them to exercise discipline initiative. And so that clear intent is, again, what it looks like, why, the why behind the how, creating that shared understanding of what we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to accomplish it. And then that discipline initiative is allowing them to act without waiting. So empowering those decisions further down the stream. And so from an implementation perspective, define the 3 to 5 priorities that you have at an enterprise level, translate it into clear intent at every level so that everybody truly understands, clarify the decision rights, not any ambiguity, make sure that people know what they can and can't authorize, what they can and can't do. So building those guardrails, kind of that framework again at Friedel, and then reinforce it as an operating rhythm. So whether that's your huddles or your dashboards or your KPIs or your all hands meeting, whatever it is, what you're trying to create is alignment, and that then replaces the need for control.
So what does a safe AI deployment actually require at an enterprise level?
Yeah, and before I go down that road, let me take a step back and bring it kind of back up to that 10,000-foot view, because I think one of the things I see in my work, and we have our own task force here at Pinnacle that works on AI. So how are we using AI? How are we implementing it in this very heavy regulatory environment? A lot of the work that we do is privileged and confidential. And so how do you have that compliance? How do you have that governance? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I think more importantly, my challenge with AI is people think it's either innovation fuel or they're kind of waiting to see what happens. And I don't necessarily think that AI in healthcare is going to be a technology failure. I mean, some will, but by and large, it's a governance problem. I also think that people deploy technology or AI as a technology deployment, right? It's actually an operating model shift. And so some of the common mistakes I see are people that are chasing tools instead of strategy. They don't really have a clearly defined strategy for deployment of the AI. They're layering AI as a fix-all over the top of an already broken system with broken workflows. And more importantly, they're ignoring the governance and accountability. It probably amplifies it. So whatever systems you have, AI is going to scale that, whether that's good or bad. So, fix the system before you scale the AI. But from a safe development, adoption, and kind of implementation perspective, from an enterprise perspective, I would say really 3 things. Number 1 is governance, right? Who owns it? Where are my risk thresholds? And kind of what does that look like for a culture of compliance, and how do I build it in? Especially in healthcare, right? AI is, for lack of a better word, it's wearing a wire. Everything's going to be audited. So how do I ensure that there's a human in the loop? How do I ensure that I have guardrails? How do I ensure that the hallucinations don't continue to push those guardrails out further and further? That I have these systems in place to refine it and to tune it and to help train it to do the things that I need it to do. But you've got to have that human in the loop. And I would also say it's not a carte blanche, right? It's not a golden ticket. It's not a magic bullet, right? You need to have use case discipline. So start with very focused use case rollout. And that is, where am I going to get high value with low risk? I think that's where you start. I would avoid kind of the broad, undefined, it's going to solve all of our problems rollout, because it's only going to amplify them. You got to have a human in the loop. This is not a bolt-on strategy. This is embedded with the workflow. Someone needs to understand the workflow, and that human in the loop needs to understand along that workflow, where can I interject this AI that's actually going to create better outcomes, that's going to take some of the administrative burden and some of the other workload off me so that I can do my best work. So the philosophy would be clear intent, define guardrails, and empowered execution. I think it applies the same for AI, right? Like, AI is not a technology in the sense of normal technology that we're used to. It is a non-human team member, and we need to govern it like one.
Speaking about team members, human or otherwise, is there a reason for leaders to think about partnerships, specifically private equity, outside vendors, et cetera, to be able to execute faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, kind of trying to look at this through the lens of kind of traditional healthcare services, hospital health systems, et cetera. Partnerships are a speed and capability strategy, right? It's not just about growth. And so if you look at these leaders, they are orchestrating these very large, complex ecosystems, even within their own facility. They don't necessarily have the time, energy, and effort to get into the weeds of each of these silos, which, again, we've already discussed. We should be breaking down those silos and creating cross-functional teams anyway. But you can't build everything internally. A lot of times the capabilities that we need to execute are going to be too specialized, and innovation cycles are too fast. And we can PDSA ourselves to death on this, but leaders in today's healthcare environment must think in ecosystems. And I think that is the filter that creates accelerated execution. It either strengthens or dilutes your strategy. And so again, speed and capability, what's going to differentiate you, and where I'm looking to buy, build, or partner, right? If I'm going to scale these ecosystems, I still want to know where I need to have ownership, and that smart partnership is what's going to create value long term. So yes, I think in an era of margin compression for traditional healthcare services, frankly, private capital is going to drive public mission. That's where this innovation is coming from. And when you find those partners that are well aligned, like don't just take the money, but find partners that are well aligned, that really, I think thesis investment is great, that are aligned with your vision, that see what you're trying to accomplish and bring that expertise to the table, then it certainly makes sense to partner. But you need to have the same wherewithal when you're evaluating those partners that you would if you were doing anything else. And there's certainly opportunity to expedite this transformation. My philosophy is that we're probably still in a sorting cycle, not a rebound cycle, and execution is going to define the rest of this decade. But if we do it correctly, it'll set up hopefully the next decade of transformation. But partners, private equity, venture capital, et cetera, technology vendors, right, are going to be an integral part of that ecosystem. So it can't all be owned internally, and you can't control everything. So create alignment where alignment exists, build, buy, partner, and build an ecosystem of efficiency around your vision, your end state, and then develop those leaders to execute. So as I tell my executive leadership team, when I talk about discipline initiative, it is, I'm going to execute under what I believe, like in the absence of orders, I'm going to execute under what I believe to be the vision. And you guys kind of help keep me within the guardrails of what do I keep doing, what do I start doing, and what do I stop doing, right? It's that informal feedback loop.
Yeah, so if this is going to be our closing question here, and it's a tough one to answer in a short amount of time, I know. But if you were talking to a CEO and they only had about 90 to 120 days to do a reset, and I'm not talking about full transformation, but just resetting your organization as it stands, what would you tell them to prioritize?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm actually going to have a discussion tomorrow with some colleagues about the first 90 days of entering an organization and kind of how you assess and where you look to make change and how you implement that change. So when I look at, how do I reset an organization? How do I look to kind of reinvigorate an organization? If we're talking like a pure turnaround, that's an entirely different strategy. I have a good colleague that is now retired and living his best life as a wildlife officer in the Rocky Mountain National Park, and he's had a great career, but he was a turnaround guy. Hey, we got to have somebody come in that can shunt the blood, that can stop the bleeding, that can focus on the vital organs, that can stabilize the ship and really get us where we need to be. And then sometimes that requires a little bit of scorched earth. And so that's probably not the person that's going to then continue on to be your transformational leader. You're going to have to bring somebody in that can then rally the troops and get them back on course and kind of move through that upward trajectory. But if I'm looking at what do I need to do within my organization, and I've got roughly 90 days, I go back to some of the same things that we've talked about. So kind of phase one is clarity, right? So, what is my, as a leader, true north? What is our organization's true north? Where are we moving towards? And then align those leadership priorities around whatever it takes to get there. And so that would be phase two. Phase one is an assessment. Hey, what are we trying to accomplish? What needs to fix? What do we need to change? Where do we need to focus energy, effort, and resources? And then the second phase would be kind of that 30 to 60 day around alignment. So where are my bottlenecks? Where do decisions need to be made? What silos still exist that I need to break down? How do I cross-level, create cross-functional teams to help us achieve these initiatives instead of a silo by silo approach? And as you identify that, you build the plan, and then 60, 90, and even beyond is the execution. So going back to implementing that freedom in a framework, now people have the autonomy and the ability to make decisions closer to the problems. They're not waiting for permission, right? I'm not saying, ask for forgiveness then permission, but if you build that framework in a way that allows people to operate with autonomy, you'll be amazed at what they can accomplish. Push the decisions downward and focus on the outcomes. So how do I get early wins, and what are the outcomes that I need to check in on? It's that trust but verify along that continuum, because I may need to course correct. I'm going to trust you to execute. I believe it's going to be done appropriately, but don't think that I'm not going to come back behind you and verify that we're on course and that we're doing the things that as an organization and as an enterprise need to be done to move this organization forward. So, you you don't fix performance by adding pressure. And I think that goes back to the old school mentality of command and control. You fix it by creating better alignment, better vision, better clarity. So clarity, alignment, execution in that order. If I had 90 days, that's how I would systematically think about a framework that I need to deploy.
I love it. That's a great way to close us off with that great recap of basically condensing all your years of knowledge and experience into that really tight framework. And of course, executing on it is where it really matters, because you can have the best vision in the world, and without the execution,
as John Maxwell once said, if you think you're a leader and have no followers, you're simply taking a walk.
I like it. Well, John, we are done. We don't have any more time. I feel a lot more empowered now with just the snippets of stuff that you've been able to share with us today. I'm going to take some of this to our orthopedic clinic we're opening today. In fact, and when people actually listen to this episode, it'll have already happened. I personally am doing a pretty significant milestone in my life. So I appreciate you being on. And if there's anything that you want my listeners to take action, whether it's connecting with you on LinkedIn or following a newsletter, or what's a good call to action that you feel like benefit leaders?
Yeah, I believe life is a people business, and that's what I love most about healthcare. And I would say there's a lot of innovation and a lot of opportunity coming out of technology and AI, but we're in the business of people, and you need to lean in, you need to develop, and you need to empower them. And together, ordinary people like you and I can accomplish extraordinary things, but belief makes it happen. And you've got to give people the tools and resources to do it. So one, Adam, I really appreciate the time, and I hope this is helpful for your audience. I think it's been a great conversation too. I'm really excited about your new opportunity, and it's great to hear. Thanks for telling me today with all of your listeners. It's an exciting endeavor. And then certainly if anybody wants to continue the conversation, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Go to our website. You can certainly find me there. It's askphc.com. So that's Pinnacle Healthcare Consulting. So askphc.com, or my LinkedIn, which is just John P. Carter. If you type in John P. Carter, I use the middle initial because there is so many John Carters. You should be able to find me pretty quickly, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it so much. And I'll close us out by saying this has been another awesome episode of Vision with Execution Show. John P. Carter from Pinnacle Healthcare Consulting has been my awesome guest. And thanks, everyone. And until next time.